Welcome to the Mixed Methods Workshop. My name is Dr. Anderson. I am the Quantitative Data Specialist and an Assistant Professor in the Department of Research and Engagement. This workshop is a part of the Research Data Services Summer 2020 Workshop Series. And as you can see on the slide, it contains my email address. So if you have any questions for me about any of the information presented today, please feel free to reach out to me directly. Before talking about mixed methodology, I want to give a little bit of background on our department at Georgia State Library. So I'm on a team called Research Data Services. We are a group of faculty members and one graduate research assistant. Each of us have extensive training in a specific area of research methodology. Dr. Swigart Hobaugh is our leader, and she is a qualitative methodologist. Joel Glogowski and Kelsey Jordan are data visualization experts. Myself, Dr. Rada Anderson, Jeremy Walker, and my graduate research assistant, George Usmanov, are all quantitative methodologists. If you have any questions about us generally, I put our link there, research.library.gsu.edu/data services. We offer an extensive amount of workshops. This summer, we're offering a ton of them. I'm going to show them all listed out on the next slide. If you are a Georgia State University student, staff, or faculty member, we also do individual and group consultations, and you can email us all directly to ask us questions. This slide contains all of the different workshops that we're doing this summer. These workshops are going to be in two formats. The first one is polished recordings, like this one. And we're also doing live sessions. The pros of the polished recordings are you're able to access them at any time. You can watch them over and over, and you can pause them. The perk of the live workshop is you're able to ask questions in real time to the experts as they show them. So just take a look at all of these. Anything that has a note that it is multiple parts, such as the SAS series or the STATA series, that means that it is multiple sets of workshops. So this one is a one-part series or a one-part workshop. And so we have some are one part, some are two part, and some are three part. So we will record each of those separately, and we'll have each of those series separately if there's multiple parts in a series. If you attend 5 or more workshops in a semester, you earn a free data services certificate. This certification is open to everyone, not just Georgia State University students, faculty, and staff. And we last semester had over 100 people complete this. The requirement to get the data certificate is pretty simple. You attend 5 workshops, and at the end of those workshops, you check in. So at the end of this workshop, I'll have all the information for you to be able to check in. Even if you do not want to get the data certification, we ask that you check in at the end of the workshop so we know who's coming to our workshops. We don't collect any deeply identifiable information beyond your email address, and the email address is only required if you want to get the data certification. You'll notice throughout this workshop, I have this pause button in the bottom right corner. I built this in very intentionally to get you to stop this recording and think about your own work. It's going to have a mixture of things like, how is this applicable to your study, as well as questions to get you to gauge if you're understanding the material well. So anytime you see a slide that has this pause button, get ready to stop the slides, stop the video so that you can do an internal check, and then I'll go through the answers as relevant following on the next slide. So let's get right into it. This next 2 hours is going to be about mixed methodology, and this is going to be mixed methods in the context of research. I do want to mention that my PhD is in sociology, and I have a survey and research methodology minor. How this is relevant to you is you're going to notice that a lot of the examples today, if not all of the examples today, are going to be social science focused. This does not mean that you have to be a social scientist to do mixed methodology. It just means that that's the manner in which I was taught, and it's the manner in which I understand mixed methodology the strongest. But you can apply this across a myriad of disciplines and topics. To understand mixed methodology, you have to understand research design. So I want to talk about qualitative research and quantitative research, and then that will lead us into mixed methods. So let's start with qualitative research. Qualitative research's purpose is to understand a social phenomenon from a holistic perspective. So how I think of this is it's a very wide angle lens. You take into things like context, understanding, jargon, framing, emotion, perception. You have a lot of rich data on a smaller group of people. A typical sample is smaller samples, and they're often non-random. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't be large samples, and it doesn't mean that they can't be non-random, but as a general rule, most qualitative research has smaller sample sizes with a non-random sample. Data types for qualitative research are commonly interviews, focus groups, ethnographies, and open-ended questions. Interviews are when a researcher sits down with someone, either literally or online, and asks them a series of questions where the other person explains themselves. So it would be something like, tell me about yourself. How did you experience your undergraduate research methods course? What is your favorite thing about yourself? Focus groups are going to be when we bring together small groups of people that are of the research target, and we ask them as a collective to talk about their experiences. Focus groups and interviews are very similar in the sense that we ask questions to people in an open-ended way for both, but focus groups are going to have the dialogue between people. And often in a focus group, the dialogue between the research participants is the most rich data that exists. Then we have some scholars like Elijah Anderson and W.E.B. Du Bois who do ethnographies. So ethnographies can be when someone joins the organization that they're studying, or they deeply embed themselves within that group over a long period of time. Additionally, open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are going to be the thing that people often get the most confused about of why is that qualitative data. If you've ever taken a survey and they have an open-ended question at the end that says, if you have any additional comments or insights, please put them here. Or a question like, please explain your perspective on the importance of core classes for first-year students at a university. These are open-ended questions in comparison to something like, what is your sex? What is your race? Where people choose from a series of predefined options. So in a survey, it can very much so have qualitative data with these open-ended questions. Now that I've given you all of that explanation, I need to give you a huge caveat that there's exceptions to each of these things. There are interviews that are rare, but they do exist and they are quantitative. There are focus groups that could potentially, in an extreme example, be quantitative, but these are just general examples. Aside from qualitative data, we also have quantitative data and quantitative research. Quantitative research purpose is to understand a subset of social phenomenon through a statistical analysis. Quantitative research is hinged on the ideology of using a sample to represent the population. So when I think of quantitative research, I think of it as a very narrow lens where it drills through and it talks with a huge amount of people about really specific topics. So the sampling and sample size, they're usually larger sample sizes, and we often say that they're a representative sample. Now, just like qualitative research, exceptions can exist. There are some quantitative research studies that have small sample sizes, and there are some quantitative research studies that don't have a representative sample. But as a general rule, most of the quality quantitative research has larger sample sizes and a representative sample. The data type for quantitative research is usually surveys with those closed-ended questions that we talked about on the last slide, scales, so things like the CESD, which is how we measure depression, the HADS, which is how we measure anxiety, and the UCLA Short Loneliness Scale, which measures loneliness. We can also use quantitative research to analyze other numerical data. So things like, if we know a student's demographic information, can we predict their likelihood of graduating with a certain degree? Can we predict their likelihood of graduating within 5 years of starting at a university? So numerical data can be collected in a myriad of contexts for quantitative research. And just like with the qualitative research, there's exceptions to the sampling, the sample size, and the data type. So you may be asking yourself, why is Dr. Anderson talking about qualitative and quantitative research? I'm here to learn about mixed methods. Well, the answer for that is pretty simple. Mixed methodology uses both qualitative data and quantitative data together. So the purpose of mixed methods research is to understand a social phenomenon through statistical analysis and a holistic perspective. So we have the benefits of the quantitative work as well as the benefits of the qualitative work. For the sampling and sample size, we have both the smaller qualitative data as well as the larger quantitative data samples, which gives us the benefit of both types of data. So what often happens here is scholars will pair together different data sources. So for qualitative, they may use those interviews, focus groups, ethnographies, or open-ended questions. And then for quantitative, they use the surveys, scales, and other numerical data. So the requirement is you have both qualitative data and quantitative data in the same study, and that makes it a mixed method study. This can be a little bit confusing if you've never heard of mixed methodology before, so I want to give you an example from my own work. This is a diagram of a mixed method study that I did. Specifically, it's from my dissertation. So what I analyzed in the white boxes and the white circles, those were quantitative data from a nationally representative study that looks at mental health, physical health, and social interaction of older adults. NSHAP is the name of this data set. It's really amazing if you're interested in any of those topics and a myriad of other topics. But what I found myself thinking was, I want to know, how does disability shape social interaction? So how is it when someone has a physical disability, how does that shape your social interaction? So that's where those two purple triangles come in. Those two purple triangles are going to be interview data that I collected of older adults who have disabilities. And I asked them about a lot of different topics, but two topics I really focused on was, what are the physical environment barriers that you experience? And what are the self-perception barriers that you experience in the context of your disability and your social interaction? So what I was able to do was use the strength of the statistical analysis, which allows me to generalize to the population of older adults with disabilities because the NSHAP data is nationally representative, but I also got to have the depth and richness of understanding people's stories from their own context from my interview data. I paired these together and I was able to really deeply understand how disability alters people's social interaction and ultimately how that influences their mental health over time. So I want to make a really clear point here that is often missed in the mixed methods literature and world when people are first learning about mixed methodology. And that is, mixed methods is not the same thing as multi-mode. So mixed methods uses both qualitative and quantitative data. However, multi-mode uses two or more modes, and those modes could be both qualitative, both quantitative, or qualitative and quantitative. So this is where it gets a little confusing. What it ultimately boils down to is mixed methods have to be multi-mode, but multi-mode do not have to be mixed methods. The reason I want to explicitly bring this point up is often when people come and they talk to me and they ask me about their study, they actually do not have a mixed method study. They have a multi-mode study. And because of that, the framing and the understanding and the different patterns that are used in research analysis are going to be different. So it's important for you to know if you have a mixed method study or if you have a multi-mode study. All mixed method studies are multi-mode, but not all multi-mode studies are mixed methods. So let's have our first paused question. Which of the following are mixed methods? Interviews and focus groups, survey with both closed-ended and open-ended questions, 2 surveys with closed-ended questions, and then interviews and surveys. So I'm going to take, and I'm just going to pause myself, and then I'm going to come back in for us to answer these on our own. So pause the slide answer them, and then hit play when you're ready to move forward. So let's dig into this. 2 of these are mixed methods. Interviews and focus groups are both qualitative data, so they will be multi-mode, but they will not be mixed methods. A survey with both closed-ended and open-ended questions is mixed methods. The thing that is often confusing about this is, earlier we talked about you need 2 sources of data. Well, the sources of data in this are the closed-ended questions on the survey and the open-ended questions on the survey. So this is a mixed method study. 2 surveys with closed-ended questions, that again is not mixed methods, that is multi-mode. And then lastly, interviews and surveys are going to be mixed methods because interviews are qualitative data and surveys are going to be quantitative data. So the next section I want to talk about is arguments for mixed methods. So these are going to be the different reasons that people say and use to justify mixed methods in their study. This section is going to be especially important for those of you who want to submit a grant or when you go to justify why you use this methods in the data and methodology section of your thesis, dissertation, publication, or conference presentation. I want to walk through each of these individually, but I wanted to put them all on one slide together for the ease of reference for you in the future. So let's dive in. The first argument is the insufficient argument. Qualitative or quantitative data alone do not explain the social phenomenon. So what this means is if I look at something that's going on and I only use qualitative data, I will miss important and pivotal information that I would get quantitatively. And the reciprocal is true as well. If I just do a survey, I won't understand the other component of the social phenomenon. So insufficient is an argument that talks about if I just use one of these, I will not have a strong understanding of what's going on. I will have an incomplete understanding of what's going on. The next argument for mixed methods is called multiple angles. Multiple angles is different than insufficient because multiple angles is the argument that if I approach this topic from different perspectives, I will understand it in a deeper manner. Insufficient says it will be incomplete. Multiple says that you will have different information from different perspectives. So there are some scholars out there who argue insufficient and multiple angles are the same, and there's some scholars who argue that inofficial and multiple angles are distinctly different. So it's good to understand the nuance between the two. The next argument is more knowledge is better. This idea that the phenomenon that I'm examining is so complex or it's really new that we need all the possible knowledge that we can for this study. So the thing that I often think about when I think about more knowledge is better is something like texting. So 10 years ago, texting was pretty commonplace, right? Well, now we have laws, especially in Georgia, about texting and driving. And then we also have shifts around things like Snapchat, things going away after a while, videos on TikTok, things like that. So whenever some new social phenomenon occurs, it's often good to collect data both qualitatively and quantitatively so that you can get as much information as possible. This is going to be especially true for a shifting social phenomenon or a new social phenomenon. The next one is scholar's preference. I'm a mixed methodologist, and therefore I want to use mixed methods for my analysis. So there are absolutely scholars in the field who are mixed methodologists. They're known as mixed methodologists, and that is the type of method that they use. The truth is, in most disciplines, there aren't people who are true methodologists. Most people have a substantive area, and then within that substantive area, they study things within the context that their research drives it. There's also people who are methodologists, and those methodologists take their method or the method that they identify or want to study, and they apply it in different substantive areas. So this is going to be more of the scholar's preference. So this would be definitely more for the methodologist in the room. The next one is learning. Mixed methodology is one of the newer and more popular techniques, and I want to learn how to do it. This is a really strong argument, especially for students. So when I was interested in learning mixed methods, mine was largely because I kept seeing it come up on job postings, and I kept seeing it come up on different grant calls of we need a mixed methodologist. So I wanted to learn it to be a stronger scholar in my field and for future job prospects. The next one is mixed methodology is intuitive. So mixed methodology is what's occurring more in real life. So I want to do this with my own research. So people often come to me and they think that this is not true. They're like, Dr. Anderson, I don't think that we actually do mixed methods. They're either I'm a qualitative researcher or I'm a quantitative researcher. So I want to give you a quick example of how I know that you actually do mixed methods. You just don't realize it. I want you to imagine that you're buying something off of Amazon and it's a pretty decent purchase. You're spending, let's say, $100. And you have two products that are within $5 of each other, so a pretty small amount. How do you decide which one to buy? Most people almost exclusively tell me, I look at the reviews, which to my first question back is, which reviews do you look at? Do you look at the stars or do you look at what people wrote? And I cannot tell you how many times people look at me like, I have no idea what I'm talking about. And they're like, of course I look at both. Well, that is mixed methods. You're looking at the star rating, which is quantitative, and you're looking at what people wrote. That's qualitative. So the truth is, most people in their daily life use mixed methods to make decisions all the time. So if you want to mirror what's going on in that, you would use this thing called the intuitive argument. We're going to see that the intuitive argument is going to be most commonly used by applied sociologists. Applied sociologists are deeply ingrained in their community, and those sociologists know that most community organizations use a mixed methods. They look at how many people are coming to this food pantry, and then what kind of responses are we hearing from people who come to this food pantry. So that is a classic example of mixed methods. So I want to give you a more clear example of how to frame mixed methods for your argument in your methodology section. I'm going to do that by pulling from that study we talked about earlier that I worked on. So the arguments for disabled and out. I decided to go with 3 arguments. Now you'll notice here that I'm not saying you have to use all arguments in all situations. My first argument was it's insufficient. Having the quantitative data alone, which is what I initially had, did not explain to me why people with disabilities had lower social interactions. I knew that people with disabilities had lower social interactions, but I didn't know why. Then the multiple angle argument. Most people who study disabilities from a quantitative perspective, and those are often demographers, or they study it from a qualitative perspective. That's often therapists and practitioners. So what I wanted to do was pull those 2 sets of data together so that we could deeper talk about the larger condition that's going on. And then, as I mentioned, I was a graduate student at the time. So my personal biggest argument, aside from needing that both of those types of data, was I truly wanted to learn how to do this. So I sought out and I followed through on a mixed methodology dissertation that would allow me to experience hands-on directly how to do this methodology that has become so popular. So I want to pause here and take a time to reflect. So this is not one where you have to answer a question to me and there's not a right or wrong, but I want you to think, now that you have just heard of these arguments, which of them fit to your study? So I would strongly suggest, if you have a study in mind, pause it right here and take, even if it's just 5 minutes, and walk through those and say, rank them. Which of these make the most sense for my study? Which of these aren't really relevant for me? And which of these should I think a bit more about? And then I'm going to pause for a moment and then move to the next slide. Okay, so now that we understand what mixed methods are and we understand the arguments for it, I want to talk through the different mixed methods designs. Now, these mixed methods designs are going to be outlined very clearly in the references at the end of this, but these are going to be the mixed methods designs that I want to talk about today in our workshop. You'll notice that 2 of them have a single star next to them, sequential, explanatory design, and sequential exploratory design. These are going to be the most common types of mixed methods, and we're going to talk about them in depth. Then we have sequential transformative design and concurrent triangulation design. We're going to also talk about these today, but we're going to spend a little bit less time on them as they're a little bit less common. Then we have 2 more types, concurrent embedded design and concurrent transformative design. These 2 are the least common, and thus I'm not going to discuss them today in the workshop. But I want to make sure that I give you the exact language so that you have the ability to go and seek these out for yourself if you are truly trying to learn a more holistic overview of mixed methods design. So we're going to go in this order and talk about the first 4 types of mixed methods. The first one is sequential explanatory design. Sequential explanatory design uses quantitative data and analysis to inform the qualitative data and analysis, and then you put those together for the final interpretation. So this is a 2-phase project. The first phase is collecting the quantitative data and analyzing it. The second phase is collecting the qualitative data and analyzing it. In this, you use the quantitative data to shape the qualitative data collection. This is going to be really important because it means that there's a heavier focus on the quantitative data. An example of this would be taking survey data and then you're analyzing it and you use the findings from the survey to inform the interview questions. So when would you use this? When you use the sequential explanatory design, how I think of it is when you want to explain the quantitative findings with qualitative data. This is going to tie closely with the study I've talked about several times, the disabled and out. So here was my question. Older adults with physical disabilities have lower levels of social interaction than older adults without disabilities. And my question is the age-old sociology question. Why? I wanted to understand, why is it that people who have disabilities have lower social interaction? My question is not, is it true? I've established that the correlation exists, but I want to know, why does that correlation exist? And the only way to understand why people experience something is to ask them, which means I needed to interview people. So the findings from my quantitative study formed my qualitative data questions. So here's my qualitative data question. The interviews were set out to ask, why do older adults with physical disabilities in relation to social barriers and physical barriers with their social interaction? So why does their disability affect social interaction? What does that have to do with social barriers? So things like how people treat you and how people perceive you, and physical barriers, things like if there's stairs to get to the event and you can't go upstairs, then you can't go to the event. So understanding how these different factors affected it. But I want you to make sure that you understand that you see that the quantitative findings define the qualitative study. So there's pros and cons to this design. The pro is the design is data-driven from representative and large sample. There's also a pretty low participant burden. It's pretty rare in a sequential explanatory design that you have the same people in the qualitative data and the quantitative data. So people either fill out a survey or they do the interview, which means it has a pretty low participant burden. We're also going to see this is going to be used more heavily by quantitative focused researchers like myself. So I'm the quantitative data specialist and I teach a ton of statistics and coding. And so it should be not surprising to most people that I heavily lean towards the sequential explanatory design. I use my quantitative findings to shape my qualitative data collection. There's also some cons to the sequential explanatory design. The biggest con is the timing of phases. You need to have a very short gap between the time of the qualitative data collection and analysis, the quantitative data collection and analysis and the qualitative data collection and analysis. The reason for this is, if you are studying a social phenomenon, something may occur between the 2 data collection phases, and then you cannot argue that they are from the same sample given the context of what's going on. A good example of this is what's going on in the United States right now with the riots related to Black Lives Matter. So if I was to collect data a couple of months ago and I was to collect data a couple of months from now, you would argue that that's a really short time period. If I'm going to study things like self-perceptions of people in the Black community, how do Black folks see themselves? Well, given everything that's going on, I can't realistically compare those data points without recognizing that my representative population is drastically different than it was in the first data collection. So the timing needs to be as quickly turned around as possible. It also means that it's a long research process. We're collecting sometimes both quantitative data and qualitative data separately and requiring ourselves to analyze the quantitative data prior to designing or collecting the qualitative data. The other con is the qualitative data is solely based on the quantitative analysis, which means you need all of the quantitative data and analysis complete before you can even design your qualitative study. So this is going to put a heavy amount of burden on the researcher to get things turned out and turned around very quickly. So we have the sequential explanatory design, but we also have a sequential exploratory design. The sequential exploratory design swaps the data phases. So first you have qualitative data, and you use that to inform quantitative data and analysis, and you ultimately put those together for your final interpretation. So sequential explanatory starts with quantitative data and then goes to qualitative data, while sequential exploratory design goes from qualitative data to quantitative data. This is also a two-phase project, just like explanatory design, but we swap them. We do qualitative data collection and analysis first, and then we follow it with quantitative data collection and analysis. The larger focus here is on the qualitative data. So an example of this is how focus group can shape interview questions. Those interview questions would have to be closed-ended, so focus group really is shaping the survey questions. So when do you use this? You want to use this when you want to use qualitative data to shape quantitative analysis or tools. We're going to see that this is extremely common in psychology. So psychology, when they want to study a mental health condition, they often get people in a room who share what they think is that mental health condition, and they ask them, what is it like to have blank? So when you look at measures for depression, most of the questions never use the word depression. It's things like, how often did you feel like you couldn't get up and get going? How often did you feel like everything was an effort? How often did you feel like your sleep was restless? Well, those questions come out of directly talking with people who experience depression, and they often say, we all see these common patterns in ourselves, and thus that's how we design the survey questions. And examples of some work that I've worked in is with the Research Data Services Group. We're really interested in what analytical skills do graduate students need to be successful in academia and industry that can be provided through research data services at Georgia State University. So we wanted to first talk with graduate students and ask what they felt like they needed to be successful in academia and industry. But we didn't stop there. We also talked with department chairs, graduate chairs, and professors who taught research methods and statistics. And we're going to use those findings to influence our future survey that will be sent out to all Georgia State University graduate students. So what we're doing is we're talking with people and getting their ideas and their perceptions prior to designing our survey. So there's pros and cons to this, just like every other method. The pro is this is the strongest design for a relatively unknown topic. And you can replace the word unknown with dynamic, so something that has changed recently. It has a low participant burden. Just like sequential explanatory design, people generally either participate in the survey or in the interview, but rarely both. And this is often used for instrument development. So that's what I was talking about earlier with measuring depression, anxiety, stress, and similar things. There are some cons to sequential exploratory design. It's a long research process. So the research process, just like with sequential explanatory design, you have to collect all of the qualitative data. Well, you have to design the qualitative data tool, collect the qualitative data, analyze the qualitative data, use those findings to shape the quantitative tool, field the quantitative tool, collect the data, run the analysis, and then put those together for the report. So it's a very long research process. There's also a very high risk that you will have to completely redesign the survey or whatever quantitative measure is being used. Now, you may be saying to yourself, but you said earlier I shouldn't design the second phase until I have the first phase done. If you thought that, kudos, because that's accurate. The truth is, though, most mixed methodologists start out their exploratory design with a baseline of what they think the survey will likely be like, or the quantitative tool will be like. And on every sequential exploratory study I've worked on, we had to almost completely trash it and come up with something new. That's the purpose of exploratory design, is to learn things that you didn't know before prior to fielding the quantitative data collection. So we've looked at sequential exploratory and sequential explanatory, which brings us to sequential transformative design. So these should look familiar. This is the exploratory design and the explanatory design, only it includes both of them. So the sequential transformative design starts with qualitative data and analysis, which informs the quantitative data and analysis and the interpretation. That's what's on the left of your screen. And then you use those findings to shape the quantitative data and analysis, which informs the qualitative data and analysis, which informs the final interpretation that's on the right side of your screen. Here's the part that often is kind of tricky. You can swap the left and right. So what do I mean by that? You could start with a sequential explanatory design and then move to a sequential exploratory design. Or you could start with a sequential exploratory design and then shift to a sequential explanatory design. A sequential transformative design requires that you use both the sequential explanatory and the sequential exploratory design together. So this wouldn't fit on the slide, so I've made it a separate slide. This has 2 data collection series, which means a total of 4 phases. So each series has 2 phases, and there's 2 series, therefore there are 4 phases. So when do you use this? Who would use this? And the truth is, most of our best theorists use this exact ideology. So in sociology, I think of Jennifer Gomez. She studies she came up with and she studies cultural betrayal theory. And as you look at her research trajectory, she really weaves back and forth between these 2 different designs. And she does it exceptionally well. So we're going to see this is really common in social science theory, and it's also very common in advocacy work. So back to those applied sociologists who study a specific group of people in the population with the intention of advocacy work. We see that they use a lot of sequential transformative designs. This is also very common for people who are using their career as a mixed methodologist, because they'll go through the sequential exploratory, then the sequential explanatory, and they often keep going back and forth to deeply understand their topic in a different way, looking at it with a different lens, with a different tool. And this is how we truly deeply understand social phenomenon. So the last design I want to talk about is called a concurrent triangulation design. So this is when you collect both qualitative data and quantitative data at the same time. So this is going to be different than any other type of design we've seen because it has one data collection period. So what do you do with this? You compare the results from the qualitative data and the quantitative data separately, and then you compare the findings for your final interpretation. So the concurrent triangulation design is going to be the design that's often more attractive to people who are writing theses and dissertations because it's a much shorter process. So when would you use a concurrent triangulation design? When you want to combine the pros of the qualitative data and quantitative data without 2 data collection periods. This is also a really great way to validate measures because each method serves as a check for the other. So if you say, I think I want to measure this topic qualitatively, but I don't know if it actually measures in the same way as the quantitative, you can measure it both ways with the same people. And if everybody who checks out as having depression with the quantitative measures checks out as being quantified as depressed with qualitative measures, that means that the measures are validated. So you can check for the consistency between measures using concurrent triangulation design. This also gives you a very holistic finding without two data collection processes. As somebody who has collected a lot of data and been privileged to be able to help with data collection on a lot of people's studies, this is a really big game changer. Data collection is time consuming, it's expensive, and it's exhausting often. So if you can collect data one time, it's often better, especially for small budgets, than trying to collect data for multiple phases. So an example of this is a study that I worked on during my master's at a university in South Georgia. So they were very interested. There was a council from the mayor that wanted to know about how people with disabilities get assistance from the city. So things like trash pickup, paying your water bill, turning on and off your power, changing the name on your power bill, things like that. So there was a small group of graduate students and a class of undergraduate students who were charged with doing this under the direction of two faculty mentors. And what we did was we actually did a concurrent triangulation design with 3 groups. We surveyed every city employee about working with people who had disabilities who needed assistance with utilities. Then we also interviewed city officials about what were their policies and what were their perceptions about citizens who needed assistance with their utility services. And we lastly surveyed people with disabilities about their assistance that they had received in relation to their utility services. So here was the idea. We want to know what they say the policies are and what they think the policies should be, and we got that from city officials. Then we wanted to know how the policies were being interpreted and implemented, which is why we talked with the surveys with the city employees. And then we wanted to know if those policies were effective for the people that they were hoping to be effective for, which were the people with disabilities. We collected all of this data at the same time over the course of one semester. It was a very busy semester, and we were able to pull all of the findings from these 3 to really give a solid report to the mayor's group so they could better understand what was going on. The mayor's group then turned around, changed some policies and practices to improve the experiences of the citizens with disabilities and their experiences with utility services. So, what are some pros and cons of concurrent triangulation design? We've talked about these a little bit, but I want to make sure that we talk about them explicitly. The biggest pro is it's a quicker data collection time because we only collect data one time. It also minimizes a thing called recall bias because the data is collected at the same time, in sampling bias because the same people are asked. I want to take a minute and explain what recall bias is and what sampling bias is. Recall bias is the difference between what actually happened and what you remember happening. So if I ask you right now, what did you have for breakfast this morning? You could probably tell me. But if I ask you, what did you have for breakfast 2 weeks ago on Wednesday? You probably couldn't tell me unless there was something special about that Wednesday or you eat the same thing every day. So recall bias is the difference between what you think happened and what actually happened. And the recall bias becomes larger often over time. And then the other thing is a sampling bias. No matter how representative our samples are, there will be a bit of sampling bias. And that's where the views and perceptions of people within our sample do not exactly match our population. In statistics, this is why we use that margin of error of 5%, that P or alpha 0.05. We recognize that there's going to be a margin of error, and we want to be able to recognize that and understand it. It's also why we use confidence intervals when we interpret many of our statistics. So having a concurrent triangulation design minimizes that sampling bias because we don't have two different samples. We don't have one for the qualitative and one for the quantitative. We have the same folks in both. There are also some cons to the concurrent triangulation design. And I've seen this top one happen more than a couple of times. You collect data qualitatively and you collect data quantitatively, and they don't come together. They do not merge well, and you have drastically different stories based on if you look at the qualitative data or the quantitative data. Another con is a thing called intra-method mixing. And this is when respondents are influenced by one method based on the other method. So intra-method mixing will occur anytime you have open-ended and closed-ended questions. It's kind of like priming. If I ask you a series of questions about things that are really sad, and then I ask you, are you having a good day? You are going to be affected by me asking you about those sad factors. Versus if I ask you about the happiest day of your life, and then I ask you, how happy are you in life right now? That will also affect it. This is similar, but not the same to intra-method mixing. So if I ask you a series of short questions that are closed-ended, that get you to choose between different predefined options, then I ask you to give me an open-ended response, you will be thinking about the answers that you already gave for the closed-ended, and they will shape how you answer the open-ended. Now, it may only affect you slightly, or it may affect you greatly. So this is something that we have to be cognizant of with our studies whenever we use concurrent triangulation design. So let's test your knowledge. What type of mixed method models are each of the following studies? So I'm going to pause here for a moment so that you can pause, try to look at each one of them and decide what kind of mixed method model are they. All right, so I've broken them down here. Phase 1, surveys, and then phase 2, focus groups. So this is when you have quantitative data, then qualitative data, which means this is an explanatory mixed methods model. The second one is an interview and then a focus group. I'm going to be honest with you, this was a trick question. This is not mixed methods. Remember, to be mixed methods, you have to have quantitative data and qualitative data. So this is a multi-mode study, not a mixed method study. I put this in here because I want you to be able to pick up on them whenever they exist. The next one is surveys and interviews, only one phase. So anytime that you have a mixed method study that is one phase, it is a concurrent mixed method study. So this is a concurrent mixed method study. Then our last one, phase 1 interviews, phase 2 surveys. So the interviews are qualitative data, and then the second phase surveys are quantitative data, which means this is an exploratory mixed methods design. If you got some of these wrong, or even if you got all of them wrong, that's a good indicator to you to go back and look at the different options of the models that exist. So the next section I want to talk about are considerations when choosing a design. So every time you set out to do a research study, you choose the design that will be used. So these are the things that you should ask yourself prior to doing a mixed method study. And I want you to ask these questions of yourself multiple times and answer them very honestly. The reason for this is, specifically with mixed methods, is mixed methods studies are a lot of work. They take a lot of effort, and they're often more expensive than other studies. So you want to make sure that if you choose a mixed method study, it is the right method for you. So let's walk through each of these. The first one is, do your research questions fit well with a mixed methods design? I want to give you an example of a mixed methods kind of topic, and then an example of something that's not really mixed methods. So the first one could be, how do people's experiences as a child affect the choices they make professionally as an adult? So you could ask that as a qualitative question or quantitative question. But the truth is, it's mixed. You want to be able to talk with people about what did they experience as a child, and then what did they choose as an adult, as well as the context in which that unfolded. An example of a research question that's not really mixed methods is, do crime rates increase when there's more police violence? Well, that's a quantitative question. You just look at the number of crimes, the number of police violence, and you convert that into a rate. So you want to make sure that your research question fits mixed methods. The way you can ask yourself this is you can ask yourself, yes, is there a qualitative component and a quantitative component to answer my research question? If the answer is no, it's not a mixed method study. If the answer is yes, it could be a mixed method study. The next one is a question about time. This is something that I think people do not give enough focus to prior to starting a mixed method study. Mixed methods research takes a substantially longer amount of time than a qualitative study or a quantitative study alone, as a general rule. There's some qualitative studies that take a really long time. There's some quantitative studies that take a really long time. But as a general rule, mixed methodology studies take a lot longer to occur than a qualitative or quantitative study. And we see this is especially true for sequential designs. So I put this on here for you so you can kind of see all of the different phases that exist just methodologically, data collection and analysis. So the explanatory is at the top, the exploratory is at the bottom. And the reason I put them both here is if you use a sequential transformative, you actually need to do all of those phases. So this was something that I made a mistake about when I was doing my first couple mixed method studies. I grossly underestimated how long they would take, and it caused a lot of stress to hit deadlines at the end. The next one is resources. You need the money, equipment, and programs needed to both collect and analyze both qualitative and quantitative data. So let's imagine that you're a qualitative researcher. I bet some of you are. I would be willing to assume that if you're a qualitative researcher, you probably have a voice recorder, you probably have a foot pedal, you probably have a program like NVivo or Deduce, and you probably have some sort of transcription software. And if you don't have those things, I want to let you know that they're not cheap. Now, let's flip the script a little bit. If you're a quantitative researcher, I would venture to guess that you have a program like Stata or SAS or Python or R or anything else. And unless you use an open resource free program like Python or R, those programs are really expensive. So the reason I say this is because a lot of times people have one or the other for mixed methods. They often don't have both. So if you are going to do a mixed method study, you need to understand that you need all of the equipment for both qualitative and quantitative analysis. The next one is arguably the most important, the expertise level. To do a mixed method study well, you need to deeply understand both qualitative and quantitative design and analytics. You need to understand this deeply, and you need to be honest with yourself about where your strengths and weaknesses are. My strength is without a doubt in quantitative methodology. I've had the privilege of collecting a notable amount of interviews over the phone, face-to-face, via Skype, different modes. But I know that my strength is the quantitative data. And so I'm always very honest with myself about that. And I try to make sure that I address that in my studies, where I spend a lot of time deeply invested in the quality of my qualitative data. So with that being said, mixed methods research often doesn't happen alone, but with a group of researchers. There's a quantitative researcher and a qualitative researcher. And there's usually some more people as well. We're going to talk about kind of looking at it as a team, but I strongly suggest if you're getting into a qualitative study, if you are able to have a quantitative person and a qualitative person on this study. Next, you need to have a large amount of knowledge on the substantive topic. So review the literature in the field to determine how much is going on and what's known about a given topic. I strongly suggest you use other studies to inform your decisions. And a really important thing that I've heard from different people, but I want to make sure that I say explicitly, is do not just look in your own discipline or your go-to journals. So as a sociologist, we have journals like the American Journal for Sociology, American Sociological Review, and different really high-level journals. Well, I often find that I get the best ideas about designing my study within my field, but I also get really great ideas outside of my field. So as somebody who's interested in physical disability of older adults, I often look in gerontology. And as somebody who's interested in social interaction, I often look in social psychology. And being interested in mental health, I look at the counseling and therapy literature. So make sure that you look outside of your home discipline when you're trying to choose a design. Look at other studies who've collected data on topics that are similar or the same as yours to really see what quality is out there. So I want to pause and take a time to reflect. I want you to think of your own study for each of those topics: research, time, resources, expertise, and amount of knowledge on the substantive topic. The next section I want to address is grant writing and mixed methods. I mentioned earlier that mixed methods are expensive, so I want to make sure that we take a little bit of time to talk about grant writing. So this is the general model that I see a lot of people using with mixed methods. It's also the model I've used with mixed methods when getting grants. And so all mixed method studies that I've been on, that I'm the PI for, the primary investigator, I've had funded through grants and resources that weren't my own pocket. So this is what I suggest. You can follow this or do something different, but this is what has worked for me. Out of the gate, have the first phase of data collection complete. So the reason for this is you can go to the review board and say, I have found this existing pattern, but I need to analyze it to understand more holistically what's going on. So that's why those explanatory and exploratory sequential designs are so great. You can go to the board and say, I've analyzed this naturally representative survey, and I really need to understand this from a qualitative standpoint. Can I have money for interviews? Or you can say, I've collected this interview data and I found this pattern. I really need to go then do a representative survey. May I have money for the survey? The other component of this is you can frame that you will have a holistic analysis and you know you will have results. And how you know you will have results is because you already have the first phase of data collection completed. You already have analyzed that data, and therefore you know that there are results. You don't have to worry about getting grant money to then report no findings. This is going to be really important for the National Science Foundation section on intellectual merit. The intellectual merit is going to be asking about how are you pushing science forward? How are you pushing outside of academia, knowledge and understanding? How are you advancing methodology? So I have a National Science Foundation DDRIG, which is the Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Grant. And this is how I funded the study I talked about earlier, the Disabled and Out. In my intellectual merit section, I talked largely about the use of mixed methodology. And I also talked about how understanding this phenomenon from a different perspective will help people in gerontology, people in rehabilitation centers, as well as family members of people with disabilities. So thinking about in that context when you're writing your grant, remember that you want to frame your grant and your mixed methods study not just about you and your research, but the implications and the purpose of that research. So the intellectual merit section is going to be how do you push science forward? You will have a similar thing for the National Institutes of Health, as well as different groups that fund research. There are different ways that people publish mixed methods. The two that I see most commonly are a 3-article model and then a book model. So I want to talk about each of these. The 3-article model, there's kind of 2 options. The first one is option A, and that's the exploratory sequential design. This is where you publish the qualitative first, and in the future directions, you call for a quantitative study. Then you publish the quantitative second, and then you call for mixed methods in future directions, and then you publish the mixed methods third. You may be wondering, why would I want to publish 3 articles for one study? The answer is really simple. Mixed methods contains more data collection and more analysis, which is great. But the downfall is it's almost impossible to talk about a high quality, large mixed method study within one publication. So if you do an exploratory sequential design, you publish the qualitative, then the quantitative, then the mixed methods. If you do an explanatory sequential design, you publish quantitative, then qualitative, then mixed. Now you will notice that these go in the order that the design exists in. So exploratory goes qualitative, then quantitative, then mixed. Explanatory goes quantitative, qualitative, then mixed. And if you did a sequential transformative design, you would write inside in sort of a 6-article model, swapping option A and B as relevant to you. If you're writing concurrent design, some people publish the qualitative and quantitative at the same time. They submit those very close to each other, and then they publish the mixed methods later. But if you want to draw a thread through your research and really show that you're establishing yourself in a field, you want to always call for the next study in your future directions. The other option, other than the 3-article option that people go with, is a book option. So the book often goes like this. Chapter 1 is an overview. Here's the phenomenon that we're examining. Here's why it's important. Here's what the study sets out to do. Chapter 2 is the quantitative analysis. Chapter 3 is the qualitative analysis. Chapter 4 pulls those together, the findings from 2 and 3, and does a mixed methods analysis. And then Chapter 5 is a conclusion. Now, this isn't the only way you can do it, but I want to show you a pretty clear pattern of how to generate this. Now, if you're a graduate student, you may be looking at this and thinking, well, I don't want to write a book, but I want to write a dissertation. This is an option for how you can frame your dissertation given your committee's permission. You would, in your Chapter 1 overview, that would be your introduction and your review of relevant literature. Then Chapter 2 would be your quantitative analysis. Chapter 3 would be your qualitative analysis. Chapter 4 pulls those two together into a larger mixed methods analysis. And then Chapter 5 is the broader implications and, what do you do with this after it's all done? How does this contribute to your discipline? Now, the next section I want to talk about, I call From the Trenches. This could easily be titled, Don't Make Mistakes Like I Have. So I want to talk about different things that have come up in more than a couple of mixed method studies that I think would be helpful for you to keep in mind as you're designing and going through your own study. And we're going to talk about each of these, but again, just like all the other sections, I wanted to put them on one slide together. So the first thing, and these are not in any specific order of most important to least important, they're just 4 things. The first thing is expert reviewers. I strongly suggest you have a qualitative person look at your study, a quantitative person look at your study, and a substantive area person look at your study. Now, I've found more often than not, those expert reviewers often become co-authors because they can understand from the unique perspective of either the methodology or the subject area deeply what is going on for that topic. So it's extremely important to understand that. My sister is a sex therapist, and her research, she doesn't have a mixed methods design, but she did this with her own research. She went and talked with people who are sex therapists and people who specialize in transsexual satisfaction before she designed her own study. And most of us do this before we do our own research, but it's exceptionally important for mixed methods. The next one is your upfront planning, should be extensive. So one of the smartest researchers I ever met told me over and over, you need to know your end goal very clearly before you ever start. Or, as they would say it, begin with the end in mind. So you want to know, what is your goal? Now, hear me say, not your anticipated finding, but what is your goal? Is your goal to understand how people with disabilities are affected for their social interactions? The reason that this is so important is it's very easy to get caught up in the methodology or the data collection or the analysis that you forget your end goal. I believe this upfront planning should be extensive so deeply with mixed methods that I have it on the front of the notebook for that study. So I'm kind of old school. I like to have papers, and I always write in big, bold letters on the front of the notebook the research question. What is the goal of this study? So that I keep it in mind throughout all of the phases of data collection, throughout all of the phases of the research. The other thing that I've learned is helpful more than hurtful is draft both measures before you collect data. Now, this goes against what was talked about earlier. So this goes against kind of the Creswell model. John Creswell is a very well-known mixed methodologist. But I like to draft both measures, and this is why. If I can draft them both, that tells me I can measure the topic quantitatively and qualitatively. If I cannot draft both measures as just a thought example, just to get it out there, that tells me I'm going to have a lot of trouble collecting the data. And if I can't figure out how to ask a question, I can't expect people to figure out how to answer it. So it's important to draft both measures, knowing that you will have to edit them, but draft both measures to make sure that you can draft both types. The other component of upfront planning should be extensive is you need to do the conceptualization, operationalization, and indicators, and then go through them over and over. If these terms seem foreign to you or things that you're not quite sure what they mean, I teach an entire series on survey design, and the first workshop on survey design is solely dedicated to conceptualization, operationalization, and indicators. Conceptualization is how you define what you're talking about within the context of the larger population. So, how do you define homeless? How would, in American society, would we define homeless? Operationalization is the definition by which you operate for that study. So operationalization is going to be the definition for the topic in your study. So maybe conceptualization of homelessness could be something like a person who doesn't have a home or a person who doesn't have a permanent residence. But our operationalization will have to be much more tightly woven than that. So operationalization could be a person is homeless if they haven't had a consistent place to stay over the last 30 days. Do you see how the operationalization is much more specific? The conceptualization is much more rooted in the general population. If your operationalization does not fit well within your conceptualization, it will be hard to generalize your findings. Lastly, the indicators are going to be the questions that are asked. These could be the open-ended questions from from an interview, or they could be the demographic questions in the survey. But you want to go through these over and over. The reason that I strongly suggest this is because you don't want to be in the third quarter. You want to be 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through your study and realize that your quantitative data collection and your quantitative data collection cannot line up. Because if they do not align and you don't have both types of data, then you don't have mixed methods. So it's really important that you deeply understand these concepts. So one more time, if you do not understand these deeply, or if you want a refresher on them, I teach an entire 3-part series on survey design. And the first part of the series is solely dedicated to conceptualization, operationalization, and indicators. The next one is you want to match the qualitative and quantitative for comparison and analysis. So this is going to be very difficult to do if you do not plan it up front. So I want to give you an example of how I do this most commonly in my studies, and I see most scholars do it in their studies. Take your survey questions and put them in the interview. Take your survey questions and put them in the interview. And I want to give you an example. I talked about the disabled and out study with the NSHAP and their RAMPS data. The RAMPS data were the interviews, and the NSHAP is the nationally representative data of older adults. What I did was I pulled some of the NSHAP questions and I asked them of the people in RAMPS. You may be asking yourself, why would I do that? Why does that matter? Well, remember earlier we talked about sampling bias and how it's important to try to avoid sampling bias. So what I do in my mixed method studies is I look at the patterns that exist with the nationally representative survey data, my quantitative data. And then I look and see if those patterns are the same in my qualitative data. If so, I could reasonably make an argument that the samples are relatively similar to each other. So if the average age, if the average depression scores, if the level of disability, if the social interactions are all similar, then I can make an argument that I can compare the findings from both of those data sources, which is what mixed methods does. It uses the qualitative data findings and the quantitative data findings. So it's important to be able to pair those and pull those together with each other. So the biggest, easiest way I have found to do this is take the survey questions and put them in the interview. So you can do this as a self-administered survey. You give the person the survey and they fill it out. I like to do it as an interview-administered survey where I just ask them the questions and then I fill in their answers from there. So that's how you can match the qualitative and quantitative. If you cannot do that, or for some reason you don't want to do that, you need to find another way to match the two over time. The next one is you need to understand that your timeline should be triple or more of that of a traditional study. So in my mind, when I say traditional study, I think non-mixed method. So either a qualitative study or a quantitative study. Part 1 would be quantitative. Part 2 would be qualitative. Part 1 and 2 might be swap based on the type of model you're doing. Part 3 is bringing them together. And the biggest thing that I learned from the trenches, and so the don't do what I do kind of moment, is there's not a do-over. So if you mess up part of the data collection later on, you can't just say, okay, well, I'm going to restart this data collection. Like, if you do that, it puts a bigger gap between time collection periods, or it pushes back the next phase of your study. And if you don't match them, then you don't really have a mixed method study. You just have two studies, one that's qualitative and one that's quantitative. So you want to make sure that your upfront planning is really extensive and that you match the qualitative and quantitative, because that timeline is going to be pushed out longer and longer and longer based on how much planning you did not do. So having like really well thought out, really well planned studies makes them go much quicker. So if you already have your sampling frame selected, if you already know the dates of data collection, if you already have interviews set up, those sorts of things will greatly push forward your data analysis timeline, because it's not uncommon where I've worked with people and I've seen that their data analysis timeline, they think that they'll get the study done in 6 months or a year, and that turns into 2 years or 3 years because they haven't put that time and effort in on the front end to make sure things are done effectively. And I do want to say that just because a study takes a long time doesn't mean that it's bad or doesn't work well. But I always think in the context of two things: graduation and tenure clocks. So if you're trying to get tenure, or like P&T is what most people call it, where you're trying to graduate, you don't have 10 years. You don't have 15 years. Like, you need to get these studies up, running, and knocked out. So that's kind of my last big from the trenches, is know that it will take longer. Do what you can to shorten that timeline through quality planning and good research choices. Now, I know not all of y'all will be from Georgia State University, but I do want to tell you about the different resources that exist at the GSU library if you're interested in mixed methods. So we have mixed methods support, qualitative support, and quantitative support. I'm going to walk through each of these individually. The mixed methods support, you're not actually talking to her, but you're basically talking to her. I am the mixed methodologist here at the Georgia State Library. So if you want help with study design, you'll talk with me. And this workshop is specifically designed to help people with mixed methods. Beyond that, if you're interested in the qualitative data analysis and you need support, For data collection, that's also going to be me. So I've collected the most qualitative data thus far out of my colleagues. And so I have a lot of experience in that if you want to talk about data collection. With data analysis, while I have done this, I strongly suggest you go to Dr. Swigart-Hobaugh. She teaches a entire series on NVivo, which is a qualitative analysis software tool, and she's very good at it. And she also has a research guide. So if you search for a research guide, Dr. Swigart-Hobaugh with NVivo, it'll come up. If you're interested in quantitative data and analysis for data collection, that's also going to be me. And I have a workshop on survey design. It's a survey design series. It's 3 parts. The first part is going to be on conceptualization, operationalization, and indicators, which I talked about earlier, as well as information on kind of general do's and don'ts of designing a survey. The second of the series, the second of the 3-part series is how to design a paper survey. And we're going to do that in Microsoft Word. The reason that I do it in Word is most people have access to Word. And then survey design 3 is going to be focused on generating an online survey, and specifically how to do that in Qualtrics. So the reason that I teach the workshop in Qualtrics is Georgia State University pays for all of its faculty, staff, and students to have access to Qualtrics. You are welcome to come to all of these workshops, whether you are Georgia State University student, faculty, or staff or not. But please know that specifically for Survey Design 3, you will not have access to Qualtrics unless you are a Georgia State student, staff, or faculty member. Beyond data collection, if you're interested in analysis, there's a good handful of us that you can talk with. You can talk with me, who's Dr. Anderson, George Usmanov, who's my graduate research assistant, Jeremy Walker, who is our newest data librarian, and Dr. Swigart-Hobaugh, who's our leader. So we also offer a lot of workshops on this. We offer a workshop series on SPSS, a workshop series on SAS, a workshop series on Stata, a workshop series on R, and a workshop series on Python. So there's also research guides associated with each of those. If you are a social scientist, you probably would use SPSS. If you are a health scientist or a demographer, you would likely use SAS. If you are a social scientist or demographer or health researcher or criminologist or economist, you may use Stata. R and Python are both open source, open access, which means anyone can download them. They are free programs. And R and Python are the programs that most people are heavily moving towards. So I would strongly suggest going to those workshops. There's also research guides generated for each of those. So if you search Georgia State Library, go to the research guides, and then you can find SPSS, SAS, Stata, R, and Python from there. The last major thing I'm going to leave y'all with is references. Now, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly with the hopes that you'll just pause them and find what you want, but I want to walk you through them. So these are all references that I think are a really good general overview of mixed methods. So if you want to look at different things that just talk about mixed methodology generally and give big picture ideas. Now, you're going to see 2 names come up here twice, Creswell and Johnson. That's not a chance. Creswell and Johnson are some of the bigger mixed methodologists, more respected mixed methodologists, and they've wrote about it quite a bit, both methodologically and they've used it in practice. You'll also notice that some of these have 3 stars next to them. That's not because they're statistically significant. They're because those are the things that I recommend the most to people. So when people come to me and they say, I need a couple of resources, like good resources that give me a general overview, those 2 things that are starred are the things that I often send to them. Beyond a general overview, if you're anything like me, that will not be enough for you. You'll want to know specific areas of interest. So I've given this specific areas of interest and I've broken it down based on topic. So if you want to do like an introduction, overview, and specific definitions to mixed methods research, that's that first section. If you want to know about collecting and analyzing data, that Creswell that Creswell article is really great. Basic designs, notations, and diagrams. So if you're someone like me who really loves a good research model and you want to figure out how to make those effectively in mixed methods, I would look at that guest. Then if you want to look at how do I do a research literature review or a review of relevant literature effectively, that's the next section. Overall quality of mixed methods research, so kind of justifying the research that Creswell is helpful. I also have, if you're interested in personal context and worldviews, so understanding it in a myriad of situations and based on what topic is going on. I'm always interested in how do I publish my work? How do I get it out to either conferences or publications? And so there's a whole set of articles right there to help you through this. I put this in here because mixed methods is not brand new, but it's relatively new in the world of research. So sometimes people struggle to get the publications out for mixed methods, and these different resources will help you understand it more effectively. And then lastly, I included a couple of things that predict, like, where are we going with mixed methods? You'll notice that both of these are a little dated, but I think they're both very relevant still. In the world of research, methodology often moves pretty slowly. So these articles give a really clear understanding of the future of mixed methods. So lastly, I have the check-in information. So after going through this workshop, which you've done, please check in. If you want to get the Research Data Services certificate, you have to check in and you have to use the same email address. Now, as I mentioned before, the summer, which is the semester we're in now, and the fall will be on the same series. So we put summer and fall together. So if you go to 5 different workshops in the summer or fall, if you between now and December, you get a Research Data Services certificate. This is not limited to Georgia State folks. Anybody is welcome to obtain this. You can check in one of 2 ways. You can either type that in to a web browser, the bit.ly short one, or you can use your smartphone and scan the QR code. Either way, if you have questions, comments, or rude remarks, please feel free to email me. My email address is on the first slide, and I hope that you really find your way through mixed methods.